Welcome to episode 70 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, at the end of the previous podcast, number 69, I said this. So, that's the end of episode number 69. Not sure what number 70 will be, although I do have a suspicion that it might be me and nobody else, because I did think earlier, and I mentioned writing book 4 at the beginning of this episode of the podcast. I did think earlier it might be a good idea to start reading, go back to book 1, Crossing Europe, and for me to start reading that in perhaps alternate episodes of the podcast. And if I do that at least once a month over the course of the next year or so, by the time I've done that, book 4 will also be ready for publication. So here we go. That's exactly what I'm going to do in episode 70 of the Cycling Europe podcast. I'm going to pick up the book and start reading from that first book about the journey that was made back in 2010 from my then home in Reading in Berkshire down to Brindisi in the south of Italy. The journey was in 2010. The book was written in 2011, published in the late summer of 2011, I think, self-published by me. And so that's 12 years ago. 13 years since the journey was made, 12 years since the book was written. I haven't actually read it for many, many years, although clearly I'm familiar with the contents. This is not going to be a glitch-free reading. One of the reasons, people have suggested over the years, why don't I make an audiobook? Making an audiobook is actually really difficult because you've got to read the whole thing faultlessly, and I'm not capable of doing that. I have attempted to do it on a couple of occasions with a few chapters, but it can get really, really difficult. I'll leave that for the professionals, for Stephen Fry and the like. But this is going to be me reading the book section by section. In this particular podcast, I don't think I'm going to get much further than the prologue. I'll make mistakes. I'll stumble over my words. I'll mispronounce things, definitely. I shall lose my thread. I shall make comments in addition to what I'm reading. So if I think something is incorrect or something has changed since, I'll mention that. So it's more than just a reading. Yeah? You can pick up the book, you can buy the book if you like on Amazon or wherever. $3.99 I think it is for the ebook at the moment. About £10 for the paperback. So here we go. Crossing Europe on a bike called Reggie by Andrew Sykes, published way back in 2011. And the book starts with, after the acknowledgements, with a quote from H.G. Wells. When I see an adult on a bicycle, I do not despair for the future of the human race. That's a cracking quote. Incidentally, I'm not actually reading from the physical book. Well, I am. What I did a few days ago, I actually got one of my copies of the book, and I took the spine off, and I guillotined off the left-hand side of the page. So I've just got a stack of about 150 bits of paper, double-sided, and that's what I'm reading from. So if you hear the rustle or the noise of paper turning, that kind of noise, then it's just me turning the pages. Right, I'm not going to read the acknowledgements either. I'll try and make clear who is to thank as I read the whole thing. There's a map in there as well, showing the route from Reading in a more or less straight line down to Brindisi, with a few wiggles here and there. And here we go. Here's the prologue. This is what I wrote. There's a T-shirt you can buy that states that there are 3 good reasons to become a teacher: Christmas, Easter and summer. And although I don't subscribe to the cynical sentiment, there's a pertinent message there for all teachers in the smugness. We're very lucky to have such a long period away from our workplaces every year, so we shouldn't waste it. Unfortunately, that's exactly what I was doing in the summer of 2008. No plans, no adventures, in fact, nothing apart from a 6-week period of slothing, from one unimportant activity to the next. The far-off Beijing Olympics were successfully filling the gaps in between. The previous academic year must have been a difficult one, and for some reason I'd resolved to do as little as I possibly could come the summer holidays. As I sat on my sofa watching the rain-drenched cycling events at the Great Wall of China, I was effortlessly working my way to achieving an A-star in procrastination. However enticing a period of 6 weeks of doing very little may seem as you're tearing your way through the corridors of a school, trying to fit in all those tasks that clearly the person who originally designed the working life of a teacher had no idea existed, the novelty can soon wear off. How wonderful it must be to do something exciting, really exciting. The kind of exciting that makes other people stop and want to know more. My eyes and thoughts returned to the cyclists at the Great Wall. That was exciting. I still have clear memories of this. This is not me reading. Really distinct memories of watching that event. Nicole Cook won the first gold medal for Britain at that event, but it was chucking it down. Anyway, back to the book. Although never quite at the standard of an Olympic competitor, to say the least, I had always been a committed cyclist. Through a combination of necessity and desire, I'd been cycling almost without interruption since the age of 10, and was proud of the fact that by my mid-30s I'd disposed of my car and was an enthusiastic cycling commuter. Admittedly, it hadn't quite turned me into the svelte, lycra-clad muscle machine that I'd once dreamt might be the knock-on effect, but my morning and evening efforts were keeping me relatively fit and healthy. So the idea of planning an adventurous trip by bike didn't take a great leap of imagination. Seeing the cyclists pedalling in the rain at the Olympics in China merely flicked the switch that had been waiting to be activated for some time. The more difficult question was to where. How could I challenge myself? I'd never done anything long distance before when it came to cycling. The furthest I'd been was down the Thames Valley to London, and on a separate occasion in the other direction to Oxford. Hardly the stuff of adventure. John O'Groats to Land's End? Exotic? Perhaps not. Around the world? A bit too adventurous, especially on my budget. Somewhere closer to home, but not too close, seemed to be the compromise. Europe, okay, but from where to where? Who did I know on the continent? It would be useful to have not just somewhere, but someone to aim for. That way, I would have a friendly face in situ to help me celebrate upon arrival. Family in Spain, friends in Germany, a former colleague in southern Italy? Yes, that would work. Cycling from my flat in Berkshire to my friend's villa in Puglia in the heel of Italy. Not a bad idea. Certainly ticked the box of being a little bit out of the ordinary. I could hear the staff room conversations already. Any plans for the summer, Andrew? Yes, I'm going to cycle to southern Italy to see a friend. Oh. Right, okay. You might hear, by the way, the noise of cars and motorbikes outside. I'm afraid that's just a occupational hazard of having your podcast studio in your spare room, which is not too far from a road. Back to the book. A frenzy of planning ensued. I had no great delusions about what I was intending to do. There are countless numbers of people who have made their way from England to Italy over the centuries. Travelling from Canterbury to Rome, two of the great centres of the Christian world, has been on the to-do list of many a pilgrim for at least the last 1,000 years. And it was in this direction that my research first went. The ancient route from Canterbury to Rome has become known as the Via Francigena. Now, I think that's how you pronounce it. I've never been quite certain, but I'm going to stick to Via Francigena. And it was first formally described by Archbishop Sigeric in AD 990. Much of my time in August 2008 was spent looking into the Via Francigena, its origins and its history. Archbishop Sigeric's original manuscript, now over 1,000 years old, is kept in the British Library, So one morning I made my way to London to see it. I had to arrange everything in advance. It wasn't just a case of turning up at the desk and asking for the reference section, and I was ushered through corridors in the hulk of the depository next to St Pancras Station. Unfortunately, an upstart like me wasn't going to be allowed to see I've lost my place, to see Sir Jerrick's handiwork, which was a little bit of a disappointment, but not altogether unsurprising. What I was permitted to look at was a copy on CD-ROM. CD-ROM, do they still exist? Which I perused at my leisure in the corner of a room full of people wearing white gloves who did have the credentials to handle the real things. I contented myself with the possibly erroneous thought that I was only a few steps away from the original document. What I could see on the computer was actually very short and to the point, not much more detail than a list of places that he stayed on his way back from Rome. It was about as far removed from the modern-day guidebook as you could possibly get, and it went as follows: Canterbury, Calais, Bruay, Arras, Reims, Chalon-sur-Marne, Bar-sur-Aube, Besançon, Pontarlier, Lozano, Gran San Bernardo, Aosta, Ivrea, Santia, Vercelli, Pavia, Piacenza, Fiorenzuola, Fidenza, Parma, Fornova, Potremoli, Aula, Luni, Lucca, San Genesio, San I can't pronounce that one, Gimignano, perhaps, Siena, San Quirico, Bolsena, Viterbo, Sutri, Roma. When I plotted these on a map, they traced a more or less straight-line journey from Canterbury to Rome. Why would he want to do otherwise? He wasn't a tourist, he was a pilgrim. And pilgrims back in the 10th century weren't on some gap-year jaunt. The purpose was to get where you were going, do whatever religious thing you had to do, and get back, hopefully in one piece. Straight lines made for short distances. My research continued online. One source described how the first pilgrims were expected to prepare and made reference to their chances of being successful. The person had to pay his debts, prepare a will, this is in quotation marks by the way, receive from his local priest his pilgrim costume, ask forgiveness of anyone whom he might have offended, and finally to say goodbye to everyone before leaving. The chances of returning were not at all good. End quote. Quite a sobering thought, but one that had resonances with my own situation. I needed to sort out my finances, I needed to get some appropriate equipment, and I also needed to carefully consider the problems that I may experience on my journey to Rome and beyond. I was only scratching the surface of research about the Via Francigena and Archbishop Sir Jerrick, but there was one thing about which I was certain. He didn't cycle to Rome. Since the invention of the bicycle, however, many must have attempted to cycle where Sir Jerrick had trodden, certainly more recently, as people have rediscovered the bike as a form of mass tourism. So that's all the history, or a big chunk of history, about the route. The next bit is more cycling focused. It was then that I found the Eurovelo network, and more specifically Eurovelo route number 5. The word vélo is French for bike, and it's not much of a leap of logic to work out that Eurovelo has something to do with cycling in Europe. Put simply, it's a network of long-distance cycle routes in Europe and is the baby of the European Cyclists Federation, or ECF. Now, if I tell you that the ECF's mission, according to their own website, is to, and again I quote, ensure that bicycle use achieves its fullest potential so as to bring about sustainable mobility and public well-being and economic development via sustainable tourism, and to change attitudes, policies and budget allocations at the European level. End quote. You'll see that we're in serious danger of entering the world of Eurobabble. So let's keep things simple. The network, set up and promoted by the ECF, consists of 12 routes, Well, that's gone up, hasn't it? I think now it's probably 16, 17, 18, at least. The network set up and promoted by the ECF consists of, back in 2010, 12 routes that crisscross the continent, and they each have a name. For example, number 6 is the Rivers route and runs from Nantes in the west to Constanta on the shores of the Black Sea in Romania in the east. Number 12 is the North Sea cycle route, which runs where you think it runs, linked up by few ferry journeys, and is the world's longest signposted cycle route. Number 5 is the Via Francigena from London to Rome, and importantly for me, Brindisi in the south of Italy. It is officially, at least, 3,900 kilometres in length. Now, it did take... I didn't know this at the time when I was writing the book. It was only a few years later when I discovered this, because there are some numbers that are missed out in terms of the Eurovelos, although they're beginning to fill them in. The reason why they're missed out is because the north-south routes, they use odd numbers, and the east-west routes, they use even numbers. So there are a few missing, although they are generally being filled in. Back to the book. This was fantastic news. Not only had I discovered the Via Francigena had a cycling route equivalent, but also that it didn't stop in Rome. It continued all the way to Brindisi in the south of Italy, just 50 kilometres away from my friends in Puglia. Someone, perhaps Sir Jerick himself, was looking down upon my fledgling plan and giving me a blessing from on high. I immediately ordered the map of the Eurovelo network. A few days later it arrived, and I had the first description of a cycle route from London to Brindisi. My work was done. If only. What had originally started as a slow, boring summer stuck in my flat drinking endless cups of coffee while watching hour after hour of Olympic endeavour had turned out to be a very active few weeks of research and planning. I'd decided upon summer 2010 for the trip itself, so by the end of August 2008, I was still 700 days away from setting off. That would allow me plenty of time to sort myself out with a detailed route plan, equipment, and also to transform myself into the lean, lycra-clad cyclist that I would need to be to ensure success. Unfortunately, despite my initial hopes, it became apparent that the description given by the ECF in their documentation about the route of the Eurovelo 5 was far from the detailed turn left, turn right, continue for 800 metres and you'll find the perfect campsite kind of thing that I'd been hoping for. What the ECF had produced was a good overview which highlighted the sections of the route where the Eurovelo 5 piggybacked upon other national or regional cycle routes, but it was lacking in any kind of detail, especially when the route arrived in Italy, and gave precious little information over and above of that provided originally by Sir Jerick 1,000 years previously. Okay, I'll pause from reading. Things have moved on big time. Go to the ECF website nowadays and you find a lot more information than you did back in 2008, 2009 when I was planning this. But it's still, the Eurovelos still do piggyback on regional, local, national routes, which is good because it means that they tend to be a bit more developed and a bit more signposted than if the ECF was just creating a brand new route from scratch. Back to the book. Over the winter months things went quiet, although I never stopped thinking about what I was intending to do in summer 2010. And my mind was constantly full of thoughts of cycling through the sun-bleached countryside of southern Europe. But I did nothing concrete to make the dream a reality. Even the website that I'd set up during the previous summer lay dormant without a single update from the end of August to the start of April. It wasn't called cyclingeurope.org at the time, but it is the same website, and you can go back and actually read the post that I made way back in August of 2008. But yeah, it did go dormant for a long time that winter. As spring approached, however, my thoughts turned once again to the practicalities of what I was planning to do. I needed to spend less time dreaming and more time doing. I'd never done any kind of long-distance bike ride before. Come to think of it, I'd done nothing long-distance before. I'd never walked the Pennine Way, never run a marathon, and even my relatively infrequent flights had only ever been short haul. Should I be worried that I wasn't a long-distance person? Would I arrive in Dover and think to myself, the last 2 days of cycling have been complete hell, this is not for me, I'm off home? Poring over maps, watching inspirational cyclists like Mark Beaumont on television, his programme about cycling around the world was broadcast, I think, in the winter of 2008-9 or 2009-10. It was perfect timing for me, and I watched it avidly, trying to glean as much information as I possibly could. Back to the book. So reading about their adventures in print is one thing, but to actually do it yourself, quite another. How would I cope with the day-in, day-out requirements of long-distance cycling? Would I get saddle sore to the extent that I wouldn't be able to even sit on a bike, never mind ride the thing? How would I confront the loneliness and solitude that I would inevitably have to experience as I made my way south? Would I still be a happy camper after several weeks under canvas? I had no answers to my questions, as I had no experience to call upon. I realised that in order to avoid that horrid Dover moment, I would need to do some kind of practice run. We may not have the best cycling facilities in Britain, but we're blessed by some enthusiastic individuals and well-run organisations which promote cycling and are gradually pulling the population out of their cars and onto the roads. And it was beginning to have effect. In 2006, the Independent newspaper reported the following. After a decade of stagnation in the number of bicycle journeys, new figures show there has been a dramatic leap in commuters and leisure cyclists focused on Britain's cities and the burgeoning network of cycle routes. In London, trips by bike have increased by 50% in 5 years to 450,000 per day, while figures obtained show use of the National Cycle Network, covering 10,000 miles of urban and rural pathways, rose last year by 15% to 232 million journeys. End quote. The National Cycle Network has its origins in Bristol in 1977, when the charity Sustrans was set up. The name Sustrans comes from sustainable transport, and let's face it, apart from going somewhere on foot, there is no form of transport quite as sustainable as cycling. The first route was between Bath and Bristol, along a disused railway track, perfect for leisurely cycling, as trains are not great at steep climbs either. With generous allocations of cash from the National Lottery, the network has grown gradually but substantially to the point where today 57% of the population lives within a mile of one of the national cycle routes. Now, I think that's probably gone down because they did have a review a few years ago, back in 2018, 2019. They reviewed the routes, and if anything was on road, on a road especially, it was taken off the National Cycle Network. So I suspect probably the number of, or the percentage of people who actually live within a mile of one of the national cycle routes has probably actually decreased. But there we go. Back to the book. I needed to find myself a route on the National Cycle Network that would be a bit of a shakedown for me as a prospective long-distance cyclist. One that would confirm my dreams that cycling is all about escape and freedom, but at the same time challenge my suspicions that actually I was just a fat middle-aged bloke who would have trouble making it to Birmingham by bike, never mind Brindisi. Having been born and brought up in Yorkshire, which is where I now live, it was an annual summer habit to return to the county where my family still live. Could I use the opportunity of my trip north to also test out my mind and body as a cyclist? I stumbled upon National Cycle Route 68. Starting in Berwick-upon-Tweed on the English-Scottish border, it made its way south alongside the Pennines, through Northumberland, across Yorkshire and finally Derbyshire, before finishing at the county town of Derby itself. If I completed the whole thing, I would end up cycling about 350 miles, but I would have the option of cutting that short by just cycling from Berwick to West Yorkshire, where I would be staying with family for a few days. Maps purchased, bike serviced, and mentally prepared for the unknown, I set off, caught the train to Northumberland, and made the following notes on arrival at Wooler, my first evening destination after cycling from Berwick. Arrived bang on time in Berwick, and the first thing that surprised me was the weather. It wasn't raining, and it was actually quite warm. The first 25 miles from Berwick to Wooler were quickly demolished in about 3 hours. The most beautiful part was as we approached the Cheviot Hills, especially the last 5 miles of the journey from Fenton to Wooler. With the hills as a backdrop, it was hard not to be impressed. Arriving at the youth hostel in Wooler, the first person I chatted with was far from being a youth, an 82-year-old former miner called Jack. He'd cycled from South Shields and put my efforts to shame. I will sleep well tonight. Now, I found out later, in fact a few years later, that the person I met, that 82-year-old called Jack, was the father of a journalist called Kevin Maguire. Kevin Maguire, he crops up regularly on the TV reviewing newspapers, and I think he's also on Good Morning Britain quite a lot. And unfortunately, Jack died a few years ago, but he was an amazing chap, and I think I tweeted Kevin Maguire just to say I'd met him. I think it was after he died, just to say, he was such a nice chap to meet. But yeah, Jack Maguire presumably was his second name. Back to the book. It had all gone to plan, and although this was the first day of 9 in the saddle, many of my anxieties concerning life as a long-distance cyclist were already melting away. The greatest relief was that I never once felt lonely. I realised very quickly that most people out there were interested in what I was doing, and this was a reason to strike up conversation. They were curious and perhaps even a little bit admiring. I had a small story to tell, and in the main, they were willing to listen. My diary was testament to 9 days of meeting new people, mile upon mile of stunning scenery, and a thoroughly enjoyable holiday. I even began to tell the people I met en route, about my plans for the following summer, and cycled to southern Italy. Back home in Berkshire, however, I was still keeping quiet about my journey along the Eurovelo 5. On the night of my 40th birthday, a few weeks prior to my trip north, I dined out with a group of fellow teachers, including my friends from Puglia, who were the only ones who knew of my intention to cycle to see them in 2010. They mentioned my plans, and another friend just laughed and then immediately changed the topic of conversation. I wasn't annoyed, as I knew, subject to the successful trial run along the Pennine Cycleway, I was getting to the point of no return. I'd invested too much time and effort in the planning, and it was slowly becoming an unstoppable juggernaut. Now, interestingly, the person at that meal who laughed, she was the person who ultimately was instrumental in me writing the book. She was pregnant in the summer of 2010. She gave birth to her daughter in, I think it was September 2010, and she was reading all my posts as I was making them, as I was cycling across Europe. And when I came back, I met up with her a few weeks later, and she said to me, "Andrew, you really should change what you've written into a book," because it was really enjoyable, and she'd enjoyed reading it in her late stages of her pregnancy. And I'd kind of dismissed the idea. I said, "Oh, don't be silly, Sally," her name was. And I just forgot all about it, and I never did anything about it. But we went out as a group of teachers, and she was a colleague at school, the following Easter, the beginning of the Easter holidays. And again, she said to me, "Andrew, have you started writing that book?" And well, I admitted I hadn't. And she said, "Well, you really should before you forget all the details." So that was the beginning of the Easter holidays. I started writing, and that's why the book was written. So she may have laughed, when we went out for a meal shortly after my 40th birthday, but actually she was the one who was instrumental in making sure the book became a reality. So thank you, Sally. Right, back to the book that she inspired. I wasn't the only person who had plans to cycle the Eurovelo 5, or at least part of it, and some of those people had started to contact me via my website. The problem was that I was still as ignorant as they were about the route, and many emailers assumed that I was an experienced cycling. I certainly wasn't that, despite my 9-day trip in the north of England during the summer of 2009. I was spending hours online doing roughly the same thing as all the people who were contacting me, trying to find that definitive, detailed route map that seemed to be the holy grail of everyone wanting to cycle from London to Rome and beyond. It became very much of a jigsaw, piecing together snippets of information that would allow me to successfully navigate a path all the way to southern Italy. The first bit in England, thanks to the National Cycle Network, was relatively straightforward, and I had already cycled the very first part of the journey from my home in the Thames Valley to London several times. From London to Dover, I had to hook up with route number 1, which starts in Edinburgh and runs all the way to the Kent port. I had quite a detailed map, and the Sustrans website provided me with the kind of detail I needed. However, once in France, I would have to start following the rudimentary instructions from the European Cyclists Federation. And this is what it said. Cross the channel by train or ferry to France at Calais. Then you follow the Canal de Calais to Saint-Omer, signed as the LF1, and continue through Lille, Roubaix, into Belgium. Here you follow the river, Canal Escaut, which is the border between Flanders and Wallonia, and then through Reims and into Brussels. My efforts to find any kind of detail about the LF1 were in vain, but I could locate the Escaut Canal. The vague through Reims and into Brussels left me with many possibilities. Now, it's interesting looking back and reading this and thinking, why did I struggle? But I did. It was really difficult to find online information. We now think we're now in a lucky position to have basically almost any bit of information available to us online. But back in 2009, yes, we had a lot of information, but the information was still a bit scant if you wanted to really find a detailed bit of specific information about something. I think, more than 10 years later, that's moved on. But in terms of the LF1 and finding information about the cycle routes in northern France was actually quite difficult. I also started to question whether I wanted to make the detour to the Belgian capital or not. I referred to it as the Belgian kink, nothing to do with any salacious activity of Eurocrats, I'm afraid, as it appeared from the map that a route straddling the French-Belgian border would allow me to make much more rapid progress in the first week of the trip. That said, I never considered the trip to be a race. If I had, I would have taken up the Calais to Brindisi Audax route. Audax cycling was, I discovered, cycling as far as you possibly could in the shortest amount of time available. It seemed to be closely related to credit cart cycling, where, to maximise the speed that person can cycle, the luggage is kept to an absolute minimum. Everything, hotels, food, replacement clothing, repairs, is paid for with the credit card, and the cyclist can therefore cycle light, as if they're doing a circular route at home. The Audax route from Calais to Brindisi had been written about in an edition of the magazine Arrivée by Audax devotee Abraham Cohen, who summed up his trip as follows. I must say that this ride took me through some amazing scenery, beautiful architecture, lovely little roads, but the pressure to complete my task stopped me from enjoying the tranquillity of the places. Quite. John Davies, another Audax cyclist from London, who had been reading my website and who had pointed me in the direction of Cohen's article, told me about two of his cycling colleagues who had completed the trip from Calais to Brindisi in a remarkable 9 days. Even he admitted that they would have chosen the shortest route rather than the most interesting, and it was certainly true for Cohen. I plotted the places he mentioned in his article on a map, and with no surprise found his route to be almost identical to that of Sir Jerick as far as northern Italy, at which point he skipped over to the flat eastern coastline of Italy to continue his journey all the way to Brindisi in the south. So although I was making my trip for the sake of the journey itself, just as much as the arrival, doesn't the name of the Audax magazine Arrivée speak volumes about the philosopher? I did want to make decent progress in the first week or so, to build a bit of momentum and get to the point where I had no choice but to carry on. Even in Brussels, it would have been easy to jump on a train and be back in London within a few hours. So I made the decision to iron out the Belgian kink. Yeah, just going back to the Audax thing. Audax is not a word that we hear much of nowadays. I think it was probably more of a 70s, 80s thing. But it's been replaced really by these long routes that people now compete for. The Trans-America race. There's one from Noordkap to Tarifa, which is a route that I subsequently did in 2015, albeit from Tarifa up to Noordkap. So that kind of event has now replaced perhaps the Audax. But I'm sure there are probably people out there who still consider themselves Audax cyclists. Right, so I've decided to basically ignore the bit of the Eurovelo 5 that goes to Belgium. I didn't do this lightly, as I started to become, online at least, the leading light in the fledgling Eurovelo 5 movement, and I wanted to be as faithful as I possibly could to the route, as set out by the European Cyclist Federation. But I came to the probably erroneous conclusion that the only reason Brussels was actually on the route of the Eurovelo 5 was because it was the home of the ECF itself. In one way it was a shame, as I'd been contacted by a keen Belgian cyclist called Jean-Marie Villon. He supplied me with very detailed route maps that he and his fellow club members had used when cycling from Brussels to the Italian border, and had even suggested that he join me for one of the sections of the route in southern Belgium. There's a bit of French coming now. Here we go. Lors de ton passage en Belgique, on pourrait peut-être organiser avec le club que l'on fasse une partie de la route avec toi. Basically, what he was saying there is that he was suggesting that he join me with some of the club members to do some of the route with me. But the lure of making good time across Europe was too strong, and I didn't take him up on his offer. I think I still regret. I'd still like to go back to Belgium and do the southern bit of Belgium, because it does get raved about in terms of the quality of the cycling and the beautiful landscape and countryside. So, although I have cycled in Brussels since, or cycled through, Belgium since, I haven't been to that southern bit, which the proper route of the Eurovelo 5 does follow. Anyway, returning to the official Eurovelo 5 description, the section south from Luxembourg seemed relatively straightforward. This is me again quoting from the Eurovelo website. The next stage leads via the Moselle cycle path back to France, this time the eastern part with very nice landscape, towns and wine, Alsace. Strasbourg has many nice cyclist facilities, and Colmar invites you in with beautiful old houses and nice cafes. Basel is an international city between three countries, and also the entrance to the well-signed national cycle routes of Switzerland. The Rhine forms the border between France and Germany, all the way from Strasbourg to Basel, and this would hopefully be straightforward to follow. No mention, however, of the small matter of the Vosges Mountains, which separate the Moselle Valley from the Rhine Valley. But there was a clear indication that in Switzerland life would be very easy following waymarked paths. Indeed, the Swiss, true to their reputation of being the masters of organisation, had an excellent website that allowed a prospective cyclo-tourist to see every possible detail of all of the numerous routes that create a lattice across the country. I was going to be following route number 3 from the border with France at Basel to the Italian border at Chiasso. And that's worth mentioning, the fact that I said a few minutes ago that the internet has moved on leaps and bounds. Well, back in 2010, the Swiss had a fantastic website, and they still do, it's called Swiss Mobility, something like that, and it's available in lots of languages, including English, and it has really clear sections for the different routes that cross Switzerland. So if you head into Switzerland for a cycle, that's your first port of call, I would have said. Back to the book. The final part of the route was described as follows. Continued to Como in Lombardy, Northern Italy has several initiatives to build cyclists' facilities. For the last stage to Rome, you follow the national cycle route of Ciclopista del Sole. It's not yet signed, but maps and guidebooks are available. There we had it, more or less the entire second half of the route of the Eurovelo 5, summed up in fewer than 40 words. What's more, it didn't seem to be accurate when compared to the scant amount of information available from FIAB, the Federazione Italiana Amici della Bicicletta. Just as the Swiss had ticked the box marked organised, the Italians appeared to be doing the opposite. I make no comment. On the overview map of the Rete Ciclabile Nazionale, the Italian cycling network, the Ciclopista del Sole didn't start in Como. It actually kicked off at the Brenner Pass, some 200 kilometres further east. It did continue all the way to the south of Italy via Rome, but sticking to the west coast and terminating west of Palermo in Sicily. The route I wanted was, unsurprisingly, the Via de Pellegrini, the Pilgrim's Way. That did make sense. It started in Como, and it too continued all the way to the south, but this time heading east towards Brindisi once it had passed through Rome. Perhaps I was being hard on the poor Italians. It was, after all, the description of the Eurovelo 5 that was erroneous, not their own national cycle network. And the FIAB website did give a little more information about route number 3, the Via de Pellegrini, including a useful list of places, Sigeric style, that the route visited. This is what it said. Itinerary, Chiasso, Como, Milano, Lodi, Corte San Andrea, Piacenza, Parma, Passo della Cisa, Lucca, Siena, Roma, Fiuggi, Frosinone, Cassino, Benevento, Melfi, Gravina, Matera, Taranto, Brindisi. This was more or less the route that I was to take, but I tried in vain to find any other further details. One email correspondent from Italy pointed out that the network was aspirational. What was said about the building of Rome? Yeah, looking back from the perspective of more than a decade, the Italians have improved significantly, and they are involved in the greater Eurovelo project, I think far more than they perhaps were back in 2010. But having cycled in Italy, not just in 2010, but in 2013 as well, you do get the impression that perhaps the Italians are still playing catch-up, even if it's not quite the situation that it was back in 2010. Back to the book. I always imagined that I would get to a point, probably sometime in late spring or early summer 2010, when everything was ticked off my list. It didn't quite happen like that. I kept chipping away in a haphazard manner at the tasks I had to do, but the running theme throughout my preparation was one of severe procrastination. Perhaps the internet is to blame. In the time before the World Wide Web, life must have been fairly simple, although we were never able to recognise the fact at the time. If you wanted to do something big, you might have discussed it with a friend or two, perhaps read a book about it, and if it involved purchasing something, the chances are you would have bought the relevant which guide to assist you. You then got on and did it. Following the information and communications revolution that has been taking place since the mid-1990s, things no longer seem so simple and straightforward. If you choose to, you can welcome literally the world into your life. And I'd managed to do this big time. Via the website that I'd set up, I was in contact with people around the globe, from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, all corners of the European continent, and, of course, throughout the British Isles. On most levels, this was fantastic. People were contacting me because they were genuinely interested in my plans, wanted to share experiences they themselves had had, and were keen to advise me on all aspects of my trip, whether it be the route planning, the bike I needed to purchase, the weather prospects en route, the best ways to cross the Alps, where I should stay, and what I should do. It was amazing, and there seemed to be no aspect of what I was planning to do upon which someone somewhere out there in cyberspace didn't have a view. However, on the level of getting things done and making some key decisions, all the information I was receiving was, at times, a little overwhelming, and simply led to indecision and delay. Clearly my own lack of experience in cycling long distances didn't help, and I was very grateful for assistance being offered. But the issue was that I was too often torn between different options whose advocates had equally strong arguments. Slowly, however, I started to distill all the pros and cons of this piece of equipment or that, whether to take one route or the other, and things did start to coalesce. In early 2010, I purchased a Ridgeback Panorama bike. It fitted my requirements well, as it had pannier racks back and front, and was made of steel, which apparently would be better than aluminium on long journeys, as it could be welded back together if it broke. That said, as I was cycling in Europe, I suspect that if it had happened, I would have just jumped on a train south and called it a day. The Ridgeback also looked good. I'm just as vain as the next person, and I saw no reason why I shouldn't look the part as I pedalled my way across the continent. There was one aspect of the Ridgeback that I didn't like, however, the drop handlebars. And here we enter a classic area of internet headbanging. You would not believe the number of web pages, discussion forums and blogs that are devoted to the multitude of handlebars that exist. Drop, flat or riser, upright or north road, porteur, touring or trekking or butterfly, triathlon or aero, pursuit, BMX, cruiser, moustache, ape hangers, recumbent, watton, to name but a few. And many of these inevitably had many variants due to some slight change of direction of the piece of tubular metal of which they consist. I dare say nowadays, 10 years later, that list is probably a lot longer. My current bike, which is a Koga World Traveller, has something called denim bars, which are excellent. They were designed by Ali Denham, the long-distance cyclist who appeared on this podcast a long time ago. It was time for a face-to-face consultation back at the bike shop, so it was there I cycled to obtain the view of an impartial observer. I was hoping for too much. The staff at my local bike shop, an establishment which I have frequented for many years, were just as fundamental in their views about the drop handlebars as anything I could have found on the internet. You'll get used to it. I really wouldn't recommend that you change them. Give it time. Now, your average employee of a bike shop, certainly this bike shop, is usually a male in their early 20s who is a lean and keen cyclist. They're the ones who, when they do wear anything in lycra, people stare in admiration rather than sorrow or even horror. They have bodies that bend, and I'm sure are perfectly comfortable when hunched over a pair of handlebars that seem closer to the ground than is feasible or indeed safe. I didn't. My own finely tuned body was stuck in a relatively upright position, and I wasn't about to cycle over 3,000 kilometres to Italy, trying to prove them right and me wrong. But they were having none of my silly talk of changing the drop handlebars to the touring or trekking or butterfly bars that seemed to be the bars of choice of the world's long-distance cycling community. Well, Mark Beaumont anyway, and he didn't seem to complain. Instinct is a useful quality, and in respect of my handlebars, I knew my instinct was telling me that by adopting flatter handlebars, and as a result a more upright cycling position, my journey along the Eurovelo 5 would be so much more enjoyable. Not only would I benefit from being able to see all the beautiful places I was passing, rather than amass a detailed knowledge of the tarmac used on Europe's roads, I wouldn't have to return home for months of physiotherapy on my back. I purchased some touring handlebars online, went to a different bike shop and got them fitted. I didn't ask the shop assistant's opinion for fear of getting one. I simply walked in and explained that I needed the old bars changing. Within 48 hours they were, and I didn't regret it. Now, just a bit of an update on the bike, the Ridgeback Panorama. It still exists, although it is in my cellar here in Yorkshire and hasn't been cycled for, 4 or 5 years now. The last time I used it on a long-distance cycle was the 2015 trip, and then I have, as I mentioned a few moments ago, now bought a Koga. It's not in a great state of repair. Perhaps one day somebody might take it to the repair shop on the TV, see if they can do something with it. Or him. We'll come to the name in a second. So I had a slightly customised bike. All I needed now were the panniers, a tent, a sleeping bag, a camping mat, some appropriate pieces of clothing, a complete set of maps, insurance, a medical kit for me, and a repair kit for Reggie, a method of updating the website from a distance, some guidebooks, a ferry ticket, a GPS device for tracking my route, some camping equipment. I refrained from listing a cuddly toy, but at times it seemed that it would be the only thing that I didn't need to get hold of. Gradually, thanks to, but often in spite of, advice from the internet and my growing band of online advisors, I was nearing a state of readiness. Reggie, the Ridgeback Panorama, was too much of a mouthful, so, as he was going to be my only constant companion along the way, he was given a name, Reginald Ridgeback, but to you and me and my band of online followers, he was called Reggie. And there ends the prologue to Crossing Europe on a Bike called Reggie. I've just noticed that actually, when this was first published, back in 2011, the title was Good Vibrations, and the subtitle was Crossing Europe on a Bike called Reggie. And I'm reminded of that because at the top of each of these pages, it's still printed Good Vibrations. I did publish it with that title, but a few months later, Amazon told me it was a copyrighted term and that I couldn't use it, so they blocked the book. So I had to drop the Good Vibrations bit. I could never really figure out what the problem was with Good Vibrations because there were lots of other books on Amazon with Good Vibrations in their title. But anyway, I had to change it, and it became Crossing Europe on a Bike called Reggie, which actually, looking back, was a good thing because it then enabled me to repeat a similar name for books 2 and book 3, although book 4 will be a bit different. So that's it. That's the prologue of Crossing Europe on a Bike called Reggie. The next episode of the podcast, number 71, will not be me reading. I think what I'll do, every even number of the podcast, I will read another section from the book. And eventually we'll get to a point where I've read all the books, but it might take quite a while. Yeah. Anyway, a bit different. Thank you for listening. Your thoughts on what I've just read, on what I've just done with this podcast, would be much appreciated. So if you want to send me an email, you'll find all the contact details at cyclingeurope.org/contact. If you'd like to help support the podcast, then all the details to help you to do that are on cyclingeurope.org/support. Many thanks to the people who have, over the months and years, made contributions, financial contributions to help keep the podcast sustainable. It is very much appreciated. One other way in which you can help support the podcast is by simply giving a rating or a review on the podcast platform where you happen to be listening to this. So that's been episode 70 of the Cycling Europe podcast. 71 will be me talking to somebody about their cycling, and then episode 72, as long as I don't receive horrible feedback about what I've just done, will be me continuing to read from Crossing Europe on a Bike Called Reggie. If you can't wait that long, then obviously you can go out and buy the book. You'll find it on Amazon, Waterstones, or wherever you happen to either buy or download your ebooks or your paperbacks. So thank you for listening. I'll be back with episode 71 very soon. In the meantime, happy cycling.